Hello and welcome back to this damnful idealistic crusade. Once again, I feel like talking to a man who likes to talk about the black bird, the Maltese Falcon. And so, being a lifelong fan of not only the 1941 film and the general story, I'm also a giant fan of Dashiell Hammett and felt the need to talk about his 1930 novel, The Maltese Falcon, that brought us not only a crystallization of everything that Hammett was doing with his famous Continental Op detective character and his just incredible literary output that started in the pulp magazine pages of Black Mask, but really I think is his one signature masterwork, and it's also unique in his own little canon. And it's amazing to think that Hammett only actually wrote 5 novels, The Falcon being the third of the 5. And then after that point, after some attempts to make it in Hollywood as a screenwriter, he unfortunately never had much more literary output outside of some short stories and writing the Secret Agent X9 comic strip, which was done by Alex Raymond in terms of the artwork. So he had a number of interesting other avenues for his writing, but it's only 5 novels we have to discuss, and then the various short stories from Black Mask, and some of which were brought together and sort of reworked and combined into the actual novels, which is something a lot of the writers of the so-called hard-boiled pulp fiction school did actually do. Raymond Chandler would sort of cannibalize stories, and a lot of the famous novels originally started as serialized pulp fiction. The Maltese Falcon, of course, did this as well in Black Mask, along with the first versions of Red Harvest and other Hammett stories. And speaking of that, the wonderful Black Lizard Big Book series has done a Black Mask volume that actually has the original multi-part pulp version of the Maltese Falcon, and I really want to get a copy of that and read it just to pore over it. I don't think it has too terribly many differences. I think it's more just a few little different bits of grammar. It's just split into the traditional way of serializing a story in a pulp magazine, so it's split into different parts instead of the individual chapters, and of course in the traditional dual column style of a pulp magazine. But that is how this story originally appeared, and like a lot of literary masterworks that have that sort of history of starting in serialized form and making you wait for each next installment long before it was ever published as a novel, that links it to works by Dickens and other legendary authors that get discussed to death in literary circles when Hammett belongs in there with them, because to be honest, I consider the Maltese Falcon not only the great detective story, but if I had to choose the one story that has everything, that has every element you could ever want, from adventure, action, romance, mystery, drama, and some of the most amazing characters and especially villains in all of fiction, that story is the Maltese Falcon. And I think that Hammett probably, he may have even felt that it was impossible to top, and he only, again, had 2 novels after this point. He never expressly spoke all that much about the Falcon and Sam Spade as a character, and Spade was not a character he returned to like the famous nameless Continental Op character, who was Hammett's most written about and appeared the most throughout the short stories and Hammett's novels featuring the Op, such as Red Harvest. But you do have to look at the Falcon in terms of coming out of the pulp magazines. So, of course, pulp magazines are all about gritty, hard, two-fisted adventure and detectives and all the wonderful sort of pulp qualities that those of us who become pulp addicts really come to these for, and that's the audience they were created for. They were designed to get people invested in a story. The price was cheap for a pulp magazine, and this is the lovely first Black Lizard Big Book collection. This one is entirely of pulp stories, which has some Hammett and Chandler in here, but again, they've also done a specific Black Mask volume. These are amazing value and belong on any mystery fan shelf. But in any discussion of Hammett and the other hard-boiled authors of the pulp school, you have to look at the pulp magazines and what their approach was, and how these authors really honed their craft, and that feeds into the novels, which a lot of the novels were built out of the pulp stories or just reworking the stories in the case of the Maltese Falcon, bringing it into novel form instead of multi-part pulp publication. But of the writers, Hammett was the one who really kicked open the door. Hammett was the one who, I mean, he's really one of the key authors who rewrote the book of how to write fiction, and Raymond Chandler always gave him credit for doing this, and famously said, and in The Simple Art of Murder, that Hammett was the one who took murder out of the drawing room and put it back in the streets and gave it back to the people who committed it for real reasons. And the connection is always drawn with Hammett to Hemingway, and that they have a similar approach in their writing style, being very direct and having very vivid, straightforward prose in terms of their writing style, and being very much contemporaries of one another. But obviously Hemingway is much more famous, but was a actual Hammett fan, and there's of course actual proof of this. And I would make the argument that Hammett's contribution to just the detective genre as a whole already elevates him over Hemingway, and I think Hammett should be discussed in the same sort of literary circles and be held to the same esteem, because he was that good, and I think he's an even better writer than Hemingway in a lot of areas, and just doesn't get the credit for it, as most of the pulp writers have only gotten that sort of literary recognition in the past couple decades. It takes a while. It's that old unfortunate rule that artists and especially writers aren't respected until they've been dead at least 50 years. And thankfully that sort of tide has already been turning. Both Hammett and Chandler and Kane and some other classic hard-boiled novels have gotten fancier editions. They've gotten Library of America editions. So there's at least some acceptance, but they're not being taught in high school literature classes when they should be. And these are classic works that are going to be much more gripping for people to come to, and in terms of what's usually the sort of bandied about same books over and over and over again. So the Maltese Falcon is, I think, also the most approachable of Hammett's novels in a lot of ways, because when you read Red Harvest for the first time, the story it sort of comes to the fore over the course of the book, but it's not as immediately clear cut as the Falcon is. Some people have accused the Falcon of not necessarily being a very complicated mystery at its core, but that's part of its iconic status. It's a story you can endlessly return to and find new facets in and immerse yourself in. And we have these immortal characters, Sam Spade, his partner Miles Archer, who's not long for this world, the duplicitous Bridget O'Shaughnessy, the legendary villain figures of Caspar Gutman and the nefarious Joel Cairo and the Gunzel Wilmer Cook. So even just saying these names immediately conjures up feelings and images, of course, mostly from the 1941 film. And of course, you immediately think of the Blackbird itself, the Maltese Falcon, the incredible artifact and MacGuffin that Hammett created, that for me is probably the greatest MacGuffin of them all, the ultimate symbol of a man's desire for wealth and great riches, and just one of the most incredible plot devices in all of fiction, and I think probably the greatest movie prop of all time for the 1941 Falcon. So it's just automatically a symbol of not only a plot device, but it's a symbol for just a man's aspiration for wealth and a place in the world, and ultimately for man's own greed and what that greed will drive anyone to do in certain circumstances. So I'm trying not to get into spoiler territory for those who have never read the novel or seen any of the film versions, but I wanted to talk about the book because most people simply look at the 1941 film and they know that it follows the book quite closely, and they don't necessarily go and read Hammett. But just because you know the 1941 film doesn't mean you actually know what Hammett wrote. John Huston's real masterstroke in the 1941 version, which of course was the third Warner Brothers film adaptation of Hammett's novel, which had previously been done in 1931 and 1936. But it was Huston and some others in the production who recognized that you have a legitimate great work of literature. You have one of the greatest stories ever written. So why not shoot the book? So the actual 1941 script adaptation is extraordinarily close to Hammett's novel. It's practically word for word throughout. I mean, the 1931 version did have a lot of Hammett's dialogue and did keep pretty much the entire plot, but it didn't land with the same impact because it was more wrapped up in being a fun, sexually charged pre-code film with a certain rawness, and it didn't do all of Hammett. Well, in the 1941 version, you're getting everything from the novel, but there are some tweaks for the production code. Some of that inherent rawness that you get a lot of in the 1931 pre-code film, that is inherent in Hammett's novel, but that is toned down somewhat in the 1941 version, again, mostly because of the production code. But also, John Huston, in his scripting process, made certain little tweaks and removals and cut a few passages here and there and removed some additional scenes and characters that actually tighten the narrative a bit. But it also, in addition to toning down that inherent roughness and that having a bit less of that raw sensibility that you get in the novel that the pre-code version went to town with, for me, I think the best way to describe the difference between Hammett's book, which came out in 1930, and the 1941 film is that the 1941 version makes the characters more mythic by toning down some of the inherent realism of Hammett's prose and the removal of some of the elements that I guess Huston felt were a bit superfluous and also were done to sort of tighten the narrative and tighten the runtime a little bit. It keeps the focus on Spade and the quest for the Black Bird and builds the level of tension while unfurling the additional layers of mystery to keep the audience moving along with Spade until we get to the big extended climax with all of our characters in Spade's apartment, which is one of the great scenes in all of film history and astonishing when you look at how effective it is when you actually study how that scene is constructed and how all the actors have to maintain their parts for an incredibly extended period of time. This is replicating what Hammett does in his novel, but when you actually sit down and read The Maltese Falcon, it very much has that sense of being right smack dab at the beginning of the Great Depression. It has more of a sense of feeling a bit raw and being of the streets, which is the magical part of Hammett's prose. Hammett basically, as I said before, he sort of kicked the doors down of bringing detective fiction back into reality and getting it out of the classical detective comes in and solves everything, and it's usually in wonderful, rich settings or that has the wonderful romance of Agatha Christie's prose. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it doesn't necessarily have the feeling of being of reality and having the grittiness of what murder and crime is really like on a day-to-day basis, particularly in a big city such as San Francisco, where the story is set and where Hammett lived and actually wrote The Maltese Falcon. So the importance of Hammett and the time at which he was writing his great masterworks cannot be stressed enough for what that did for not just detective fiction, but really for helping a modern fiction to emerge, and he doesn't get enough credit for that. When you read The Maltese Falcon, it plays a little bit differently. The characters are a bit rougher, and Spade himself is described as is often quoted in the opening paragraph as seeming like a blonde Satan. And there are extra developments between the characters. There is more to the relationship between Spade and Miles Archer's wife, Iva Archer, and the sort of romance that Spade doesn't want anything to do with, and how he disgusts himself. There's a lot more of a nuance in a gritty sense with all of the iconic characters, and you also get differences that you couldn't have in the 1941 film. As for example, Spade and Bridget O'Shaughnessy actually do sleep together in the novel. Their relationship is actually fully consummated, and we do get more of their sort of purported romance in little extra bits of dialogue that they not only couldn't include in the film, but also some things that Huston did trim or change the focus on a little bit. So it's one of the great examples of how to understand the screenplay adaptation process of a great novel. It's so much harder to adapt a great work of literature than it is to adapt a piece of junk, because with a great work, it's so much harder to bring the spirit of that to the screen with all of the limitations. And of course, the 1941 film was not a big budget Warner's A feature for that year. That's why they were letting John Huston take a crack at it as a first-time director. They didn't have a lot of belief in this. They gave it enough of a budget, but it still had a smaller budget and a smaller shooting schedule. And only because of John Huston and the incredible cast and crew and producers behind him, that is why the 1941 version is lightning in a bottle. And I think this quality of making the characters a bit more mythic makes the already timeless story, it distills the elements of Hammett a little bit. So I think reading the novel only feeds into one's appreciation of the 1941 film. And I think, in turn, the 1941 film, if that's your experience with the Falcon, and then you pick up Hammett's novel, I think that enriches the reading of the novel. So they go hand in hand, and it's so incredibly vital to have a sense of the other when you're either reading or watching the other. So for people who say they don't necessarily like the Maltese Falcon film all that much, or they think it's a bit too simple, or it's sometimes labeled as being the first film noir, which is of course debatable. You can say Stranger on the Third Floor and noir didn't really get full backing and acceptance and until Double Indemnity became not only successful but was nominated for awards and really showed studios that there was something to this adapting of hard-boiled fiction and pulp stories and crime stories, and that sort of got the seed fully planted in a lot of studios' heads. And that's when what we term a lot of noir films now really started to explode in terms of numbers being produced. But the 1941 Maltese Falcon adaptation is really this sort of core film that set the precedent that eventually Double Indemnity picked up that ball and ran with it. And so that makes some people, again, I think, sort of overlook how important the 1941 Maltese Falcon film is and its strengths. So to everybody who's ever felt that way, I think it's extraordinarily important and helpful to go and read Hammett's novel, because that's only going to enrich your experience with the 1941 film. And they very much are joined at the hip, and you will see the little tweaks that John Huston made. And again, I think it emerges that the film has this more mythic rendering of Sam Spade and his code, and all the other characters have a greater sense of the story itself becomes more mythological. I think the whole notion of the Maltese Falcon is really part of American legend. I mean, I cannot say enough of why I think the Falcon story itself is, I mean, quite frankly, if I did have to name the greatest story ever told, I do think it is the Maltese Falcon, because it speaks to so many elements of life, and the story itself is timeless. It's just available in different flavors. If you prefer the slightly rougher and raw sense of these characters and this particular story, you have to come to Hammett's novel. If you still need some of that in a film version, I think the 1931 Pre-Code film is remarkable for that era and for getting Hammett's novel on the screen, but it really ups that Pre-Code raw energy. But it's the 1941 film that crystallizes everything, and Huston's adaptation distills what Hammett's themes were. The main sort of of tweaks. You see there's one or two extra scenes with some of the police that are removed, and I can understand why. They do seem a little bit superfluous. And then there's also, interestingly, in the novel, there's a side character. Caspar Gutman actually has a daughter who is only really in one scene and is really only used to convey a slight piece of information, and then she never reappears again. So there are some things in the book that are unique to it, and they will be surprises if you are only used to the 1941 film. So even though John Huston very much followed what Hammett did, practically word for word for, at least 95% of it, there are little differences, and you also couldn't do Hammett's tone entirely in terms of a 1941 film due to the production code. But again, I think Huston used that in a way to distill what Hammett was after, and Huston was always somebody who did this because he respected the work of a writer, because he himself was a writer. And this coming at this point in his career in 1941, this was after he had done the script for High Sierra, which was the film that really broke Bogart out of being gangster number two who gets killed in the eighth reel of every Warner's film. And that was working from W.R. Burnett, and Huston really adhered closely to the spirit of Burnett's novel without ever straying from it. And I think that experience was what he brought into adapting Hammett, and that's what makes the 1941 film such a perfect distillation of everything Hammett was after. But again, you do really need to look at the novel. You can't just look at the amazing film, which I think actually makes some slight improvements in that sort of distilling of Hammett's themes and making everything a bit more mythic. But Hammett's novel is still one of the most honestly profound American novels there is. It is a true towering work of literature, and the sort of inherent raw energy does make you really get into the story, and you basically fall into the world of the search for the Falcon in San Francisco. And because it's being written in 1930 and it's got this energy, and the characters are a little bit rougher around the edges, and Spade himself is a rougher character, but he still has the inherent moral code. It's just a slightly different rendering if you're so used to the 1941 film. And again, it manages to have all of the strengths of Hammett's prose, but it's got a ridiculously strong sense of narrative. The actual mystery by the end of the book, every element is ridiculously clear, and that means you can come back to this story over and over and over. It is timeless because the story itself is so perfectly understandable. A great story needs to be read or encountered and completely understood in order for all of the themes and what the writer's trying to convey to come across to an audience. And again, the genius of what John Huston did in his adaptation is not just the fact that he stuck to the book and he actually made Dashiell Hammett's book, and he avoided the pitfalls of the previous two film versions, which the second film in 1936 was Satan Met a Lady, and Warner tried to turn it into a bizarre comedy, and that was not a good idea. So Huston obviously learned from the previous two attempts Warner had made with this story. But really what he seized upon, and the real genius, is that he distilled Hammett's themes, and he knew he had to tone some elements down because of the production code, but he also trimmed some things for time, and it gives the story just a slightly greater sense of focus. But again, the core spirit is there in Hammett's novel and in the 1941 film, perfectly realized, but the tone is a little bit different. And you've also got 11 years separating the two. So it's one of the all-time great examples to study of a great work being adapted to another medium. And how do you convey that same spirit and where possible, you're just having to massage it slightly to get it into this different medium, and you have different constraints at the time. So and also the 1941 film manages to also recreate the scenes in Hammett's book, but also use the visual medium and the nuances of performance and the things that are not spoken, the reactions, the looks, the close-ups, the cutaways, the low camera angles, invisible ceilings, and attempts at using deep focused style photography. Huston is using the cinematic medium as well to make Hammett's prose breathe on the screen and actually live in those moments. So he's trying to recreate the sense of the feeling you get when you read Hammett's book, because when you read The Maltese Falcon, you literally feel as if you're in these individual moments and that these are real characters. And the only thing that is not in the film that is an iconic moment from the book is something that I don't know if it was something Huston cut for time or he just couldn't really find a way to make it work in terms of how you'd handle it in the film. But it's an extended story that Spade recounts. It's an anecdote he recounts from his earlier days as a detective to Bridget O'Shaughnessy. And Hammett just literally has Spade go into this without any sort of prompting, but it's just pulled out of him. It is the Flitcraft parable about a man that suddenly disappeared one day for no reason, and Spade tracks him down years later. And it's one of the most incredible passages you'll ever find in not only Hammett, but it's an incredible anecdote that literary scholars have analyzed to death. It's such a meaty piece of philosophy and just an incredible piece of writing that it seems like something that Hammett probably did encounter in his days as an actual Pinkerton detective, because Hammett was drawing on his own life experiences for his writing, and that comes through in every bit of his prose. But the Flitcraft story revolves around this man who suddenly disappeared one day, and when Spade tracks him down, he recounts this story of how he was simply going to lunch one day. He had a simple, wonderful, seemingly happy, perfect existence with his wife and kids at home, no financial worries, a nice, decent job at an office. But one day he was walking to lunch and is almost killed by a falling beam. And this sort of upends his entire life, and he decides he now has to go off and, as Spade says, he essentially adjusts his life to waiting for a beam to fall and suddenly kill him. And so he goes off and just disappears and wanders about the world for a number of years until eventually coming back to the States and relocating in a completely different town under a different name, and then slowly over time managed to not only get married and have kids and have another house and have another sort of simple job, but you can see how his life has essentially reverted and snapped back to a sort of echo of what he had before. So essentially, he's recreated his original existence from years before, and it's just an incredible piece of writing that has always stuck with me. And it's not in the film. It's not really in any of the film versions. Now, again, I can only assume this was just something they couldn't really figure out how to put into the film and then how to depict it visually, or it was just cut for time or something. But that's the one major element of the book that is unique, and that alone is worth reading the novel for. But honestly, all of Hammett should be read because his work is that important and that just life-changing when you read it for the first time. But of his novels, I think that The Falcon is the most approachable for people who have not read a lot of hard-boiled fiction, or who aren't necessarily fans of detective stories, or who are used to a more traditional style of detective story, or who want to read one of the great mysteries. So The Maltese Falcon is a good entry point into Hammett, but it's also, it should be stressed that it's also a little bit atypical. This was Hammett sort of reaching for something a little bit different. It is a different identity to his Continental Op stories. Sam Spade is very different from the Continental Op. There's a lot of similarities, and they each have their own sort of personal moral code, and you can recognize the Continental Op elements in Sam Spade, but Sam Spade has more of a personal identity, and Hammett at various points sort of alluded to the fact that Spade is essentially the sort of private detective that all detectives wish they could be, with that strong moral code and that ability to navigate what Chandler referred to as the mean streets. And Spade is, obviously a mythical character. He is a bit stronger, obviously, than anyone would be realistically, and that's why I think Hammett recognized that he had created this sort of perfect private detective character. But he does give him some human qualities and flaws, and that makes the character endlessly fascinating. But you really do need to look at Hammett's novel and not just rely on the 1941 film in terms of looking at why this story is so important and looking at the different ways it plays depending on what version you're looking at. But without Hammett's novel and without his literary output, to be quite frank, modern detective fiction would not exist. And it's debatable if any of the other major writers, particularly Raymond Chandler, would have had the same sort of acceptance by major publishers. And Hammett is really the one who first kicked open the door and kicked down the door for this new breed of hard-boiled fiction that felt of the streets and of reality to reach the American public at large. And that's why he is the big name, along with Chandler and James M. Cain, basically forming the sort of big trio of names of the hard-boiled school of writing. And that's why, if anyone is going to look at this era of fiction and this genre, it's going to be those names that are focused on the most. And Hammett is the one that really was that sort of lightning rod, and this is reflected in his prose. I think that sort of that flavor of what literary critics refer to as being Hemingway-esque and having an incredible directness to the reader that always hits. It always is striking. It's always gripping because it's so striking and direct. But he has this incredible ability to weave in not only descriptions, but a sense of feeling and a sense of place and time. The San Francisco of the Maltese Falcon is so incredibly lived in and so vivid that you picture it in your mind when you're reading the novel, even if you're not thinking of the films or you've never seen the 1941 film. When you read Hammett, you feel these characters are real, and you can envision the moments in your mind. And if you know and love the 1941 film and you're reading Hammett, you sort of, as you're reading it, you can envision this version of the story, and you're in your imagination, you're sort of mashing together the iconic film elements with the sort of tougher version in Hammett. So you can picture Bogart's Spade doing the slightly tougher elements of what Hammett's Spade is doing. And with a knowledge of what Hammett wrote, that only enriches the 1941 film, and it sort of fills in some of the little gaps that some people might complain about because they had to work around the production code. And it just enriches all of the little moments, and it, of course, enriches your appreciation for the film just by understanding the sheer genius of what John Huston did in both adapting the novel in his screenplay and the little tweaks he made, and how he carried out and brought Hammett's spirit from Hammett's prose to life, not just on the script page, but in the language of cinema. That is why the 1941 version of the Maltese Falcon is arguably the most perfect film ever made. It is absolutely flawless, and by making some slight tweaks and really honing in on what Hammett's approach was and what his themes were, John Huston actually manages to distill Hammett's core theme and what the Maltese Falcon is about. So the novel and the film go hand in hand, but they're so joined at the hip, you can't really separate them. The film is the iconic version that everybody knows and thinks of, but Hammett's novel must be examined and studied. It's an absolute masterclass in writing and is just as vivid and alive today in 2023 as it was in 1930 and before that in the pages of Black Mass magazine, which is one of the greatest well springs of creativity in all of literature, just for the quality that was on display there and how that magazine birthed so many of the great American writers. Of course, the one major element you might be expecting is the iconic final line of the 1941 film, and you don't get that in Hammett's novel. I think that underlines why I go after this sort of idea of the 1941 film makes the story more mythic, and it's debated whether it was John Huston or Bogart himself who came up with the final line of the film, riffing on a line from Shakespeare's The Tempest. It's, the greatest ad lib anybody's ever made, and one of the great closing lines there is. But the fact that was put in there and they decided to end the film there at that moment and not shoot Hammett's ending, which we have in the book, I think really underlines this sort of difference in tone that's slightly there, and that distilling Hammett's themes and making everything a little bit more mythic, because in Hammett's novel, we actually then go back to Spade's office, and it does end on a down note, but a much greater sense of a downer end note than what we have in the film, because there's a sense of not only does life go on, but so do all of the negative elements that grind a person down, and Spade has to be confronted by them once again, and his own guilt and his own sense of self-loathing. So there's a resignation there. And they were going to shoot this for the 1941 film, but they had already shot the rest of the film and realized that where they had finished shooting, which is the ending we have in the film, was already so strong that it crystallized everything the Maltese Falcon was about, and the script John Huston had wrote and the film he had shot. And so everyone sort of agreed that that was the perfect place to end the 1941 film. And they did go back and reshoot a few angles and sort of spruce it up a little bit, because it wasn't originally intended as the actual ending. But I think rather rightly, for that adaptation, they realized that Hammett's actual final scene from the book was a bit of an anticlimax, and also fought against this sort of mythic quality I've been referring to. Whereas in the book, it's absolutely necessary to have that, because it underlines that sort of slightly darker grittiness that's in Hammett, and that Spade resigns himself to his fate and is living with guilt and having to just continue on. So I think that's another important distinction, and probably the thing that's going to jump out to people immediately if you only know the film version, that here in the book we have the actual different ending, the sort of coda that is much darker and more realistic, and much more of a downer. This is reflected in Double Indemnity, because the 1941 Falcon and Double Indemnity are two cornerstone noir titles that get discussed and analyzed endlessly, as they should be. But in Double Indemnity, Raymond Chandler and Billy Wilder dumped James M. Cain's ending in terms of what he wrote for the book, which is completely different to what we have in the film. They did have an ending that they actually went and shot, but was actually removed. Apparently, it was something Billy Wilder actually decided on, because the final ending we have in the film Double Indemnity, while it wasn't intended as the ending, and they actually shot the full ending of the gas chamber sequence that we only have a still of, by cutting that and ending where that film does, it crystallizes the central relationship of the film and is the perfect grace note to end that film. So what Billy Wilder did there in Double Indemnity is the exact same thing that John Huston did in 1941 on the Maltese Falcon. They just hadn't actually shot the ending that Hammett wrote. They were going to, but everybody just realized this is the perfect place to end this particular rendering of Hammett's novel. But that's another distinction between Hammett's novel and the 1941 film, and why it's so incredibly vital and important to read Hammett's novel, which is one of the great pieces of literature, period, and arguably his absolute masterwork, even though all of his novels are great. I just think The Maltese Falcon is the one that just so completely endures. Even for people who have never read the story, they will immediately recognize what Hammett is after, and how so much of pop culture and fiction in general has pulled from or riffed on or directly ripped off this iconic story, which for me remains the greatest mystery and arguably the greatest story ever told. So those are just some of my thoughts on Dashiell Hammett's literary masterwork, the 1930 novel The Maltese Falcon, the third of his 5 incredible novels, and just still to this day one of the greatest books I have ever read and ever will read. I just wanted to talk about it more because I don't think it's discussed enough. It is one of the truly great legendary novels that everyone should read at least once in their lifetime, if not multiple times. There are many wonderful editions. I myself really prefer the lovely Black Lizard vintage crime paperbacks, which are still in print, but I just love reading the hard-boiled school of novels, and Hammett and Chandler especially in this particular way. But of course there's also the lovely Library of America collected editions of Hammett, which are essential, and it's also great that we have most of Hammett's short stories and other works collected, but you do have to track down a bunch of different volumes. And for the real Falcon diehards, again, I just don't have a copy and I really want to get one, there is the Black Lizard Big Book of Black Mask Stories, which does actually contain the original Black Mask published version of the Maltese Falcon, should you wish to actually read Hammett's story in segments the way it was originally done. And I hope to do that at some point, and I will do a little follow-up video on that as well. But I just wanted to talk more about the Blackbird because I can never stop thinking about the Blackbird. I have been completely fascinated and enraptured by the story of the Maltese Falcon ever since I first encountered it in the 1941 film as a kid growing up. And then finally getting to read Hammett's novel was absolutely astounding. It was the first Hammett book I read, and just seeing how the characters we know from the 1941 film were and how they felt on the page, and what Hammett could do with just an incredible direct prose style, and the things he was conveying, and the fact that he was doing this before most anybody was, and it's just still unbelievable what he could do with just words on a page, and invest them with not only such a sense of space and time, and make his stories so live so vividly in the reader's imagination, but how he could get at so much of American society and just human nature at large. I mean, I think The Maltese Falcon is one of the great stories about human nature, about life in general. It means so much more than being just simply regarded as a detective story. Anyone who thinks The Maltese Falcon is just a detective story or a mystery, or they think the 1941 film is just a film noir or a detective movie, does not understand this story at all. The Maltese Falcon is one of the great stories about life and man's inhumanity to man, and what we have done to ourselves in this society we have created. I think it's one of the most profound stories ever written, but I am biased. I think it's one of the great novels, and I think it's still, I probably, if I had to name one particular story that has all the great elements of storytelling, I do think The Maltese Falcon is the greatest story ever told. It is not a simple, mere mystery. It needs to be examined and returned to time and time again as one of the great timeless stories of all fiction. So those are just some of my thoughts on Dashiell Hammett's The Maltese Falcon, one of the great literary experiences I think you can have. If you've never read it before, or if it's been an extremely long time, please go and get a copy from whatever source you can. And if you don't actually own a copy for your own library, you really should. And I would recommend just go ahead and getting all of Hammett's novels and his short stories, because he is one of the great legendary writers of all time. So as always, please do keep supporting your local independent bookstores wherever possible. Maybe go and try to pick up some Hammett editions if you can. And of course, anything helps keep your local bookstores in business is always great. As always, keep reading print books, and thank you ever so much for watching.